Hey guys, it's Nick the Booksmith. Welcome back. For today's Craft Time mystery, we have to take the way back machine to 1914 Hungary. About 60 miles southwest of Budapest, there was and still is a small farming village called Nagyrev. In the early 20th century, it was little more than a couple muddy streets with some small cottages, a church, and the obligatory pub. Our story begins during World War I with men beginning to return from the war. And for Hungary, it was a losing war. Many of them had been exposed to a lot of trauma, and no doubt they inflicted it as well. And the only treatment available for conditions like PTSD was what could be found in a bottle of plum brandy. But life was no picnic for their wives either. In those days, marriage was not always a matter of choice. Women, and often very young girls, were given away to much older husbands. And sadly, domestic violence and the mistreatment of women went unchecked. In a village like Nagyrev, it wasn't just traditional religious customs, but also politics that made independence from husbands out of the question for married women. They weren't allowed to own property. They couldn't sign legal documents. So basic body autonomy was impossible. So if a husband was abusive or inclined to drink excessively, a typically strained financial situation could become a matter of life and death. To make matters worse, there was no local doctor. So if somebody got sick or injured, it would mean traveling to a larger town or waiting until the doctor, who did come around once a week, to show up. But life as the village of Nagyrev knew it would all change when a woman called Auntie Susie arrived. She was a midwife with a huge understanding of plant medicine. She was incredibly intelligent and quickly became the go-to for not just delivering babies, but she treated all sorts of injuries and ailments. However, the thing about Auntie Susie was her habit of offering a permanent solution for women in desperate situations. Nearly drown in a frigid pond and now you've got pneumonia? How about a broken hand from a farming accident? Uh-oh, you say you're pregnant and already have too many mouths to feed? Not to mention that pesky, abusive drunkard you're married to, right? Yeah, Aunt Susie had a remedy for everything. Now, to be clear, I'm going to be totally honest, she wasn't the only woman that was doing this at this time, whether it was rural Hungary or anywhere else for that matter. I mean, in France, they called arsenic inheritance powder. So I guess it was maybe not common, but definitely not unheard of. But what made Auntie Susie different from the rest was not just the vast number of customers she served, but the lucrative enterprise she was building while doing so. I'm sure you've probably seen a show on Dateline or 60 Minutes of situations where rampant, nefarious activity was being carried out in broad daylight with little or no consequence whatsoever. And for something like that to happen, a powerful list of ingredients must come together at just the right time to create an ideal set of circumstances. For our perfect storm today, we're going to need 1 world war, losing side only please, an impoverished farming community, a mixed assortment of oppressed, or at least unhappy, wives, a dismissive town clerk, and 1 ambitious midwife, preferably homicidal. To be fair, maybe it all started innocently enough, as a compassionate response to a plea for help from a battered wife at the end of her rope. But after doing my research, I came to another conclusion. One that Auntie Susie most likely knew exactly what she was doing before she ever stepped foot in that tiny village in the countryside of Hungary. Because it was far too easy for her to start playing God with the lives of local villagers for this to be an accident. You see, it wasn't just about helping women get out of desperate situations. It also served to be a most convenient method to make people disappear. People that maybe were in the way. Problematic people. 160 people or more, to be precise. If it's one thing midwives knew, it was town gossip. And women were telling Auntie Susie everything, their most personal problems. And when they would confide in her about their life with husbands, boyfriends, and sons who were returning from war, she offered a unique remedy. She'd say, "Why do you bother with him? I have a simple solution." This solution was arsenic, which Susie made by boiling flypaper, regular flypaper, and skimming off the poisonous residue. And she'd keep a vial in her pocket at all times, just in case. Just FYI, they don't make flypaper with arsenic anymore. So if anybody is out there and they've got thoughts in their head that they shouldn't have, sorry, you are out of luck. But I know what you must be thinking. Okay, yeah, it's a remote area. It's the early 1900s. People died all the time. But 160 plus people? How in the world did nobody know? How did this get overlooked? Cue the dismissive town clerk. Observant residents of the surrounding villages, not just Nagyrev, but like several others, did notice and were trying to get the attention of the town clerk of Nagyrev. Unfortunately, this town clerk was gentry, and that meant he was appointed, not elected, to his position. He pretty much had concluded that all these people were being overly dramatic, simple-minded peasants and wouldn't give them a second thought. And maybe timing is everything, because it just so happened the Spanish flu was spreading like wildfire. And lucky for Auntie Susie, the flu took some of the heat for all those villagers dropping like flies. You see, the symptoms for the Spanish flu and arsenic poisoning could be somewhat similar. Dry cough, head and body aches, sore throat, chills, loss of appetite, extreme fatigue. But even though the flu could be blamed for some of these deaths, Auntie Susie had to be very careful. Let's say someone bought arsenic from her to take care of a problem. If they didn't put enough poison in the brandy or goulash, the victim would be violently ill for a couple of days, but they could recover. If this scenario happened too many times, a person could build a tolerance, meaning that even more poison would have to be administered next time. Yeah, there was always a next time. In addition to that, the one doctor that would visit came just once a week, and only if the roads were passable. And that goes for the police patrols as well. So basically, from early winter to late spring, Auntie Susie could do as she pleased without anyone checking up on her. And sometimes Auntie Susie would use the doctor's visits to her advantage. Someone could be given just the right amount to be ill enough for the doctor to be called. The doctor, not expecting the patient to be poisoned, would make a diagnosis of whatever else he came up with, give directions for treatment, and promise to return the next time he was in town. If that person ended up dying before then, well, it's rural Hungary in 1920 or whatever, so no surprise, right? But it deflected some of the suspicion of the death being a crime if the doctor had done an examination but misdiagnosed the patient. He would have been more to blame, if anything. Combine that with people getting frantic to get out of extreme circumstances, and you can see how things could get out of hand really fast. Maybe a wife's husband or son was abusive. Maybe he was just inconvenient. Who's to say? And it's not like anyone had to seek out the midwife. She always made herself and her cure-all available. Patty McCracken, author of The Angel Makers, wrote that it seemed Auntie Susie would at times even take it upon herself to dispatch with problematic people without their families knowing, likely in hopes to benefit herself in one way or another in the long run. So maybe by now, you are coming to the same conclusion that I did. It was definitely not charity driving Auntie Susie to extend her services to unhappy wives. During her stint as village midwife, she was charged with some crimes of malpractice, but never seemed to spend much time in prison. It wouldn't be too long, and she'd be back, even more determined to carry out her lethal business. But in 1929, after 15 years of everyone practically tripping over bodies and still not making the connection, Auntie Susie's rampage finally came to an end. A suspicious death in a nearby village and the continuous flood of anonymous letters being sent to the town clerk would finally point the finger back at her. In all, 29 people were charged in relation to these crimes. 16 of them were convicted. 4 of those were executed. Others served life sentences or died in prison, and then the rest were set free. It seemed to boil down to whether or not they could get a confession, because even if an autopsy found arsenic in a victim's system, it's not like it could be proven how it got there, especially if the death had occurred years earlier. Though several people paid a price for being implicated, Auntie Susie never went to trial. It's said when authorities came to arrest her, she ended her own life rather than return to prison. And that, my friends, is the story of the angel makers of Nagyrev, and how one woman set into motion a chain of events that ended the lives of over 160 people. Unfortunately, there's not much information to be found about the victims who lost their lives. I guess it's not surprising, considering the time period, but it is still frustrating. Before a few weeks ago, I had never heard of this, but there is so much more information that I couldn't include in this brief story. So if anybody wants to learn more, I highly recommend reading The Angel Makers by Patty McCracken. She actually lived in Hungary when she learned of Auntie Susie and this murderous ring, and she traveled to Nagyrev and the surrounding villages to speak to descendants of the perpetrators and victims. She also debunks narratives that are still told as truth down to this day, and gives a very well-researched report on the events. And with that, I thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate you more than I can say. Please stay safe out there, and I will see you all really, really soon in the next video. Bye, guys.